There is a question at the heart of the oldest stories. Not who are you, though that matters. Not what have you done, though that matters too. The oldest question, the one that survives every civilization, every retelling, every century of forgetting and rediscovery, is simpler than either of those. Where is home? And the harder question beneath it, what would you endure to return there? Nearly 3,000 years ago, a poem was composed in the eastern Mediterranean world, a poem so perfectly formed that it has never gone out of circulation, never been lost, never been superseded. Scholars conventionally date it to the 8th century BCE, though the stories it drew upon were older still, carried by oral tradition across the chaos that followed the Bronze Age collapse. The poem was attributed to a poet named Homer. Whether Homer was one person or many, whether he composed or compiled, has occupied scholars for centuries and will occupy them for centuries more. What is beyond dispute is the poem itself. 24 books, 12,000 lines, the story of a man trying to get home. The man's name was Odysseus. He had been away for 20 years, 10 at war, 10 at sea. He would not be easy to kill, and he would not be easy to save. He would lose everything he set out with, every ship, every man, every treasure won at Troy. And he would arrive home alone, in rags, with nothing but his name and his wits and the particular burning 20-year certainty that home was worth all of it. This is the Odyssey, the complete journey told whole. To understand what Odysseus is returning to, you must understand what he is returning from. Troy had fallen. After 10 years of siege, the great walled city on the coast of Asia Minor was ash. The Greeks had achieved what the poem's companion epic, the Iliad, had promised them: victory, glory, the burning of a civilization. Odysseus had played his part. It was his idea, tradition holds, that built the wooden horse, the hollow ruse that ended the war, while the greatest heroes of Greece battered themselves against the walls for a decade. But victory in the world of Homeric epic is never without cost. The gods had been offended during the sack of Troy, temples violated, suppliants dragged from altars, and the Greeks, who had spent 10 years praying to those gods for success, would pay for those offenses on the journey home. Some would be shipwrecked before they cleared the Aegean. Others would arrive home only to find murder waiting. Agamemnon, the commander who had led them all, would walk through his own front door and be killed in his bath. Odysseus would face a different fate. Not death, but delay. Not murder, but the long-wearing year-by-year attrition of a journey that refused to end. At home in Ithaca, a small rocky island off the western coast of Greece, his wife Penelope waited. His son Telemachus, who had been an infant when his father sailed, was now a young man who had grown up hearing only stories of the father he barely remembered. And the palace was full of suitors, 108 of them, as Telemachus himself would count them out for his father, one island at a time, in a single speech in Book 16 of the poem. Men from the island's noble families who had decided that Odysseus was dead and that Penelope was available. They ate his food and drank his wine and competed for his wife's hand, and there was nothing a woman alone and a fatherless boy could do to stop them. The Odyssey is two stories running in parallel. One of them travels the sea. One of them waits very carefully in a palace on an island. Homer, characteristically, does not tell either story in sequence. The poem opens in medias res, in the middle of things, with Telemachus and with Odysseus already 7 years into his captivity on Calypso's island. The hero's wanderings, the years of ships and monsters and gods, are recounted later. Odysseus himself narrates them in books 9 through 12 to the court of the Phaeacians who will finally carry him home. It is one of literature's great structural choices, the wanderings as a story told by the man who survived them, retrospective, shaped, controlled. For clarity, what follows tells the story in the order it was lived. They left Troy with 12 ships. The first stop was Ismarus, the city of the Cicones, a Thracian people allied with Troy. Odysseus and his men raided the city and took plunder. He urged them to leave quickly. They did not. They feasted on the beach instead, and by morning the Cicones had called for reinforcements from inland, and the Greeks lost 6 men from every ship before they could reach the water. 72 men gone at the first shore they touched. The journey was already paying its toll before it had properly begun. A storm drove them south, past the Cape and across the open sea to the land of the Lotus Eaters, a people whose food, when eaten, dissolved all memory and all desire. Some of Odysseus's men ate the lotus and ceased to want to go home. He dragged them back to the ships by force, weeping, and tied them beneath the rowing benches. The world, it was becoming clear, was full of things that would make you forget who you were and where you were trying to go. The Cyclops came next, and what made it different from every trial before it was not the scale of the violence, but the permanence of its consequence. His name was Polyphemus, and he was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. When Odysseus landed on the island of the Cyclops and entered the great cave in the hillside, he waited. Homer tells us he wanted to see whether the inhabitant would offer the hospitality that was sacred obligation in the Greek world. Polyphemus offered nothing of the kind. He sealed the cave with a boulder no crew could move, ate 2 men for dinner, slept, ate 2 more for breakfast, and penned the rest for later. What Odysseus did next is one of the foundational acts of cunning in all of Western literature. He found a great olive wood stake in the cave, hardened its tip in the fire, and drove it into the sleeping Cyclops' single eye. When Polyphemus screamed and the other Cyclopes gathered outside, asking who had hurt him, he said, as Odysseus had known he would, that nobody had hurt him. Nobody was the name Odysseus had given himself. They escaped, clinging to the undersides of the Cyclops' rams as he rolled the boulder aside in the morning to let the flock out. Safe on the ships, Odysseus made his mistake. He called back his real name across the water. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, from Ithaca. He had blinded the son of Poseidon, and now Poseidon knew who had done it. The prayer Polyphemus sent up to his father was specific. Let Odysseus not reach home, or if the fates required it, let him arrive late, alone on a foreign ship, to find suffering waiting. every word of that curse would come true. They came to the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who received them with hospitality and sent them away with a gift. All the contrary winds sealed in a bag of oxhide, leaving only the west wind free to carry them home. They sailed for 9 days. Ithaca was visible on the horizon. Odysseus had been awake for 9 days at the helm, not daring to sleep. He slept. His men, convinced the bag held treasure he was keeping from them, opened it. The winds tore out and drove every ship back across the sea. Aeolus refused to help them again. He could see that the gods were against them, and no man helped those the gods had abandoned. So the crews rowed. 6 days with oars, bodies already hollowed out by Ismarus and the Cyclops, and the opened bag, and the hope that had turned to nothing in a single night. On the 7th day they raised a coast, and Odysseus made a decision that would save his own life at the cost of nearly everyone else's. He moored his own ship outside the harbour at the sea cliffs. The other 11 ships moored within. The Laestrygonians were giants. When the scouts came to the palace, their queen was described as vast as a mountain. Their king called for his people, and they came to the cliff tops, not with swords but with boulders, and smashed the ships below like fish in a barrel. They speared the men from the water and carried them away to eat. 11 ships, already battered, already short of crew from Ismarus and the Cyclops both, gone in an afternoon. Odysseus cut his mooring rope and rowed away. 1 ship, that was what remained. The Laestrygonians are the catastrophe that popular retellings of the Odyssey most often omit. They should not be omitted. This is the moment the scale of the journey's cost becomes absolute. With nothing left of the fleet, the sole surviving vessel came to Aeaea, the island of Circe. She was a goddess, a nymph of terrible power with a human voice, and she invited the crew into her house, fed them, and mixed something into the wine that turned them into pigs. All except Eurylochus, who had waited outside, who ran back to Odysseus with the news. Odysseus went to the house alone. On the way, the god Hermes appeared to him on the path and gave him a herb called moly, its root black, its flower white, that would protect him from Circe's drugs. When Circe raised her wand, nothing happened. When Odysseus drew his sword, she invited him to bed. He stayed a year. It was his men who reminded him, eventually, of home. They came to him, now restored to human form, and said plainly that it was time to go. Circe told him what the journey still required. Before he could see Ithaca, he must first go somewhere worse. He must sail to the edge of the world and descend into the underworld, the realm of the dead, to seek the counsel of the prophet Tiresias. No living man had done this. Odysseus went. The underworld in Homer is the land of shades, the dead as shadows of what they were, drinking the blood Odysseus poured into a pit to briefly restore their voices and their memory. Tiresias came first, and what he told Odysseus was not vague comfort or riddles. It was a map of everything still to come. He named the cattle of the sun god Helios on the island of Thrinacia, which must not be touched. He described the suitors waiting in Ithaca and told Odysseus how to deal with them. And then he described what must happen after. Even after the homecoming, even after the suitors are dead and the house is clean, Odysseus must take an oar from his ship and walk inland, away from the sea, into the heart of the continent, until he meets people who have never seen the ocean and mistake the oar on his shoulder for a winnowing fan used to thresh grain. There, far from any shore, he must plant the oar in the earth and make a great sacrifice to Poseidon. Only then will the god's wrath be satisfied. Only then will the curse be fully lifted. The homecoming will happen, but the penance will outlast it. Then came the others. His mother came. He had not known she was dead, and when he tried to embrace her, she passed through his arms like smoke 3 times. She told him that Penelope was faithful, that Telemachus was grown, that his father Laertes was still alive but broken with grief. The great heroes came. Achilles, who had chosen a short, glorious life over a long, quiet one, now telling Odysseus flatly that he would rather be a slave among the living than a king among the dead. Agamemnon, murdered by his own wife, warning Odysseus never to trust a woman. Ajax, who refused even to speak to him, still furious over a quarrel about armor that had ended in Ajax's death, and in the poem that preceded this one. The underworld is the emotional midpoint of the Odyssey, and Homer knew it. This is where Odysseus understands fully what the journey is costing him and what it is costing everyone connected to him. His mother is dead. His friends are dead. Even glory in the mouth of Achilles sounds hollow. And Tiresias has told him plainly, the homecoming is not the end. There is a sacrifice still owed to the sea. He must get home, no matter what it costs. They passed the Sirens, whose song promised not seduction but knowledge, the power to know all that has ever happened on the earth, which is the only temptation that would genuinely stop Odysseus in his tracks. With the crew's ears stopped with beeswax and Odysseus lashed to the mast, straining against the ropes. They passed through the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, 6 men taken by Scylla, the 6-headed monster on the cliff, while Odysseus watched and could do nothing because the alternative was the whirlpool of Charybdis destroying the ship entire. And then the cattle. Homer gives the men the choice as clearly as it can be given. Tiresias had said, "Do not touch Helios's cattle on the island of Thrinacia." Circe had repeated it. Odysseus repeated it again. He wanted to sail past without landing at all. His men insisted on one night's rest on the island. Then storms kept them there for a month. Their provisions ran out. Odysseus was asleep when they did it. His lieutenant Eurylochus, the same man who had waited outside Circe's house, the cautious one, the survivor's instinct turned suddenly reckless by hunger, persuaded the others. Better to die quickly at the god's hands than to starve slowly on an island. They slaughtered and ate the sacred cattle. When the winds finally lifted and they launched, Zeus obliged Helios with a single thunderbolt. One ship, Odysseus alone, clinging to wreckage, drifting back through the strait, past Charybdis again, which he survived by gripping a fig tree above the whirlpool while the ship's keel floated back up beneath him. He drifted for 9 days. He washed ashore on Ogygia. Calypso. She was a goddess, a nymph, Homer says, daughter of Atlas, and she loved him. That word should be used carefully. Homer uses it. She gave him everything. Her island was beautiful beyond description. Running water, fragrant timber, birds beyond counting. She offered him immortality. She offered him eternal youth. She offered him the thing every mortal most fears to lose, laid out plainly, in exchange for nothing more than staying. He sat on the shore every day and wept toward the horizon. 7 years. 7 years he was held on Aeaea, not chained, not imprisoned, but unable to leave without a ship and without the gods' permission. He shared her bed, he ate at her table, he watched the sea. This is one of the Odyssey's most important statements, and one of its most quietly devastating. That given the choice between immortality with a goddess and mortality with a human woman on a small rocky island, Odysseus chose mortality. He chose Penelope. He chose Ithaca, with its rough terrain and its politics and its ordinary grief. He chose to be finite and to go home. The gods eventually agreed he had waited long enough. Athena interceded with Zeus while Poseidon was away at a feast. The decree went out. Odysseus was to be freed. Calypso, commanded by Hermes, gave him tools and timber and helped him build a raft with her own hands. He sailed for 17 days. A storm sent by Poseidon wrecked even the raft. A sea goddess gave him her veil to keep him afloat. He swam for 2 days and washed ashore on the island of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians were a people beloved by the gods, gifted navigators who lived at the edge of the world. Their princess, Nausicaa, found him on the beach. Their king, Alcinous, received him and fed him and asked him, when the time came, for his story. And Odysseus told it. Everything from the Cyclops to the raft. The journey as only the survivor could tell it. Every ship, every man, every mistake, everything he might have done differently. Homer gives us the entire middle of the poem, the wanderings, all 12 adventures, as an after-dinner recitation, one man talking in a great hall by firelight, and the room going completely still. The Phaeacians gave him passage. They loaded their fastest ship and set Odysseus aboard, sleeping, and sailed through the night. When the ship arrived at Ithaca's shore, they lifted him, still sleeping, and carried him to land with all his gifts arranged around him. He woke not recognizing his own island. Athena had covered it in mist. She appeared to him in the form of a young shepherd, told him where he was, told him what waited at the palace, and transformed him, old, ragged, unrecognizable, so that he could enter his own home in disguise. He went first to the swineherd Eumaeus, faithful after 20 years. His dog Argos, ancient, lying on a dung heap, too old to rise, lifted his head, wagged his tail, and died. He had waited 20 years for this moment. Telemachus came, and Odysseus revealed himself to his son in private, and they wept together, and then the disguise went back on, because the plan required it. The plan required timing. Penelope had bought time for 3 years by weaving a shroud for Odysseus's aging father Laertes by day and unpicking the work by night, a ruse of patience and nerve that had nothing soft or passive about it. When it was discovered, she needed another. She announced that she would marry whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads set in a row. None of the suitors could string it. The old beggar at the back of the hall asked if he might try. The suitors mocked him. Penelope said yes. Telemachus cleared the women from the hall. The doors were locked. The weapons the suitors might have reached for had already been quietly removed. Odysseus strung the bow, drew, and sent the arrow clean through all 12 axe heads without touching one. Then he turned it on the suitors. What followed was not quick, and it was not clean. Homer does not make it clean. The suitors scrambled for weapons that were no longer there, threw tables up as shields, cowered against the locked doors as Odysseus and Telemachus and 2 faithful herdsmen moved the length of the hall. Arrows found men in their chairs. Spears crossed the width of the room. The men who had eaten his food for years and treated his house as their own and threatened his son's life died in the wreckage of the feast they had been sitting at. When it was over, every one of the 108 suitors was dead on the floor of the hall. And then the hardest thing. Penelope did not come running. Homer is too careful a poet for that. She came downstairs and sat opposite the man who claimed to be her husband and said nothing. She had been deceived before. She was not a woman who could afford to be deceived again. She sat and studied him the way you study a thing you have been trying to see clearly for 20 years. She tested him. She told the servant to move the marriage bed outside the room. He reacted as only the man who had built that bed could react, with sudden, specific outrage. The bed could not be moved. He had built it himself around a living olive tree rooted in the earth, shaping it into a bedpost. No one alive but him and Penelope and one trusted servant knew that. And Penelope wept. Not at the revelation, at the 20 years before it. Her arms were around his neck at once, Homer writes, and she wept and was not ashamed. The journey was over, 20 years. One man, one woman, one island. Let that sit for a moment. The Odyssey has been read continuously for nearly 3,000 years. That is not a figure of speech. There has never been a generation in the Western tradition that did not have access to this poem, never a century in which it was not being translated, commented upon, retold, argued over. Virgil structured the Aeneid around it. Dante borrowed from it. Tennyson wrote Odysseus in old age, restless and refusing to rest. James Joyce mapped the entire city of Dublin onto its structure. Kazantzakis wrote a sequel. Madeline Miller gave us Circe and Penelope from the inside. And in 2026, Christopher Nolan brings it to cinema, the latest point in an unbroken 28th century tradition of retelling. Why? Part of the answer is the hero. Odysseus is not the strongest man in the world, nor the fastest, nor the most fearless. Achilles was all of those things, and Achilles is dead, killed in the book before this one, and speaking bitterly about it from the underworld in the middle of this one. The Odyssey is a poem about a man who wins ultimately by thinking, by endurance, by cunning, by the particular intelligence required to adapt to whatever the world throws at you and keep moving toward home. That is a more democratic kind of heroism than slaying the best warrior on the field. Most of us will never be Achilles. Many of us will recognize something in Odysseus. But the deeper answer is the question the poem carries in its structure. What is home? The Odyssey's answer is not sentimental. Odysseus is offered immortality and refuses it. He is offered rest, comfort, beauty, and the absence of grief, and he declines. What he chooses instead is specific and difficult. A rocky island, an elderly father, a 20-year marriage, a kingdom that needs restoring. Home is not an abstraction in this poem. It is a particular bed built into a living tree. It is the knowledge of a specific person, what they will test you with, what question will finally convince them. Homer also asks the parallel question, what did Penelope endure? Her 20 years are as present as his, if you read the poem with both threads in view. She held the palace through 20 years of siege by other means, not war and monsters, but patience and politics, and a particular kind of courage that the poem has sometimes been accused of undervaluing, but which the structure itself never does. The olive tree bed is hers too. The test is hers. The reunion, in Homer's telling, is a meeting of equals. There is a school of Homeric scholarship, ongoing, rich and unresolved, around the question of oral composition, whether the Odyssey was shaped over generations by singers who gave it different emphasis in different tellings, before being written down in something close to its present form. The poem is built for voice, its repetitions, its epithets, its formulaic phrases were not stylistic laziness, but mnemonic architecture, the structure that allowed a singer to hold 12,000 lines in memory and render them in a hall that went still. The poem was meant to be heard. Every listener since is part of that tradition. Tiresias told Odysseus in the underworld that the homecoming would not be the end. There was still the inland journey to make, still the oar to carry, still the sacrifice owed to the sea. The gods do not release their claims cheaply, and the Odyssey is honest about that. The poem ends with Odysseus and Penelope together, but the penance is still ahead of him. Some readings find that troubling, others find it the most truthful thing in the poem. That arrival is not the same as resolution, and that the work of a life continues past its most dramatic moment. The Odyssey is ultimately the story of what it costs to be human in a world built by forces larger than you. The gods can curse you, detain you, destroy you, and they can help you, guide you, grieve for you. But they cannot live your life for you, and they cannot choose home for you. Odysseus alone decides on Aeaea that he would rather be mortal and finite and Penelope's husband than immortal and forgotten. That choice, made alone on a beach at the edge of the world, is the poem's axis. Everything before it is the question. Everything after it is the answer. Nearly 3,000 years ago, someone sat down or stood up in a hall at night with an audience and told this story. A man who wanted to go home and spent 20 years becoming someone worthy of arriving. The story has been told 10,000 times since. It will be told 10,000 more. Somewhere in those 12,000 lines, in the oldest poem in the Western tradition, there is a bed carved from a living tree and rooted in the earth. It cannot be moved. It is still there. This legend has been told. Subscribe and return to Aeonkeep. More legends await.